Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Even though all biosimilars have the same amino acid sequence as biologics, there can be some differences in things like packaging and delivery method, and so that can be really, really important and impactful for patients.
Welcome to Breaking Down Biosimilars, a podcast that brings light to biosimilars and helps you better understand the role they play in your healthcare now and in the future. I'm Zoe Rothblatt.
And I'm Connor Mertens. Both of us are patient advocates and community outreach managers at the Global Healthy Living Foundation. During this series, we cover everything you need to know about biosimilars, what they are, how they work, and who should take them.
We also hear from a few people who've been taking biosimilars about their own experiences. And we cover some of the common myths about biosimilars and try to separate fact from fiction.
So Zoe, this time we're looking at what it takes to get a biosimilar drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration, or as we know, the FDA in the US.
Yes, and we're really going to focus on how this impacts you as a patient. We'll start by looking at what goes into getting a biosimilar approved. And along the way, we'll introduce concepts about how biosimilars are regulated by the FDA and what this means for patients in real life taking a biosimilar. And it does get a bit confusing with some of the terms that pop up, like interchangeability.
But not to worry, we'll talk it through like we always do.
Exactly. And we'll also hear from a few experts along the way that can help fill in some of the gaps for us, especially when it comes to the big terms.
So biosimilars started getting approval around 6 years ago in the US, is that right?
Yep, that's right. Even though they've been on the market in Europe for the last 16 years or so. So here in this country, biosimilars are kind of like the new kids in town. And while approval process is a bit less time consuming than for a reference drug, the biologic itself, it's still a pretty big deal.
So how exactly does that work?
Well, one nice thing is that when a drug company or manufacturer proposes a new biosimilar, it doesn't have to go through all of the same clinical testing as the biologic drug that's based on. That can save time and money.
In what way?
The scientists already know the properties of the reference drugs because of all of the clinical trials that were conducted for them initially. And this actually explains that term, reference drug, which is talking about the biologic that the biosimilar is based on. The biologic serves as a reference for the biosimilar, so they don't need to go through all of the work again because the blueprint is there.
Got it. So there's no real need to repeat all those same trials for the biosimilars.
That's exactly it. But what's important to note is that the FDA is still really strict about making sure manufacturers can prove that a proposed biosimilar is just as effective as its reference drug. There are still lots of hoops to jump through. They have to show that the biosimilar's active ingredients work the same way as the reference drug.
So that's for the active ingredients. What about the inactive ingredients?
Good question. There may be slight differences in the inactive ingredients between the biologic and the biosimilar, but the biosimilar manufacturer also has to show that those won't affect the safety in any way.
Okay, that helps clear things up. But I often get questions and concerns from patients about the approval process, and I'm glad we're breaking it down together. And that reminds me, another question I hear a lot is about how biosimilars are named and how to tell by the name if it's a biosimilar or a biologic.
The FDA also came up with a unique naming convention for biosimilars. It can be a bit confusing. So to help with this, I spoke with Criswell Lavery, a clinical research coordinator at the University of Pennsylvania. I asked her to describe how the naming convention works.
They take the generic name, the non-proprietary name, which is like for Humira, it's adalimumab, for Enbrel, it's etanercept, and then they add a 4-character suffix onto the end of it. This 4-character suffix doesn't have any meaning specifically. It's a group of 4 consonants that are just nonsense. And the reason that they do that is just because it's a way to distinguish between the biosimilar and the biologic without giving precedence to either of them. So if you're saying that this is the original and this is the derivative, I think that can have connotations with it. And so by giving everything a 4-character suffix that has no inherent meaning, it really is just a way to distinguish between the different types.
So Zoe, you're telling me the FDA created a system where part of the drug's name has no meaning?
Well, That's because you may have a few biosimilars that have the same formula as a single biologic, but they're different in very minor but very specific ways. And like we talked about in episode 1, biosimilars are drugs made from living organisms, so it's really impossible to get 100% duplicates. And as Criswell told me, there was a lot of thought put into the naming convention with those random letters. So, if these letters don't have any meaning, why are they there? What meaning do they have? Does it have to do with safety? Do these names have real world implications for patients taking biosimilars?
It absolutely has implications for safety, for pharmacovigilance, making sure that the right drugs are prescribed and delivered to the right patients. So even though all biosimilars have the same amino acid sequence as biologics, there can be some differences in things like packaging and delivery method. And so that can be really, really important and impactful for patients. For instance, one of the biosimilars has latex in the packaging and in the delivery system. And so it's very important to distinguish between the original and the latex delivery system because some people are allergic to latex. You can get into dangerous territory when you use mostly the brand name to refer to all of the biologics and the biosimilars because the pharmacist will go based on what's on the prescription. By putting the 4-character suffix on there, it allows prescribers to really say, this is the one that I mean, and this is the one that I think will be most useful for my patient.
Okay, so that makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong. Every biosimilar has a brand name, just like the biologic does. So, for example, the biologic infliximab has the brand name Remicade, and the biosimilars for infliximab also have brand names. So these are Inflectra, Renflexis, and Avsola. Did I pronounce those right?
Yes, you are on fire.
See, I can do my homework too. And let's say you aren't familiar with the brand names. The way that you know what a biosimilar is that it will say infliximab-DYYB, for example. And each of these biosimilars have a different 4-character suffix from the other, whereas the original biologic will just have that core unbranded drug name.
Exactly. So if you're a patient taking a biosimilar and you order your medication from the pharmacy, you can look at that label and see, okay, there's the 4-character suffix next to that core name, so I know that this is a biosimilar. And if it doesn't have that 4-character suffix, you'll know it's the biologic.
There's so much to pay attention to and so much that goes into the naming. I'm glad we're diving into this.
Yeah, and I brought this up with Criswell about how much there is to pay attention to. So, who is it incumbent upon to make sure that the patient is getting the right drug? I mean, there are a lot of players here. You have the doctors, the pharmacists, the patient, maybe the person administering the medication. Whose role is it to make sure things are going smoothly? Is it a group effort?
I would say it's definitely a group effort. A lot of pharmacists will make sure they'll triple check and say, hey, you prescribed this for a patient with a latex allergy. Did you mean to do that? Are you 100% sure? Of course, pharmacists can't be the last line of defense checking everybody, so it's also on doctors to make sure that they are educated on all the different kinds of biosimilars and making sure that they know the difference between the brand name and the non-proprietary names and how they're different and why those differences are important. I think it's on patients to be educated and to make sure they're talking with their doctors and making sure that they are involved in their treatment as possible.
So, what was the process actually like when you were working with the FDA?
The FDA is obviously heavily invested in making sure that the drugs that they're representing, that they're putting their seal of approval on, are being used to the best of their ability. And a big part of that is making sure that they're doing the most that they can to see that drugs are administered safely, accurately, and with all of the support that they need. They were really, really driven to understand how their name convention was being used. And I think that's pretty admirable, that it's not just that you're putting out the standard and saying, this is the standard and you have to follow it. They follow that up with research and saying, how is it being used? How's it being received? And I think that it was, at least for me, heartening to see that the follow through was there.
So this is really important. One of the goals of biosimilar drugs is to bring down the cost for patients. How's that working out so far?
It's still a little bit early to tell because biosimilars are relatively new to the US market. But there's one specific aspect of the approval process that's designed to reduce both cost and the approval time. Any idea what that's called?
No, but I have a feeling it's going to be way too big of a word for me.
It's pretty big. It's called extrapolation.
You're going to have to explain it a little more for us, Zoe.
Well, in that case, I think it's time to call in another expert. Dr. Robert Popovian is Chief Science Policy Officer here at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, and he has tons of experience working with biosimilar manufacturers. I asked him about extrapolation.
What does extrapolation mean? You don't have to demonstrate safety and efficacy of the biosimilar in every indication that that product may have. Extrapolation is also important in that because if we don't have the ability to extrapolate, we're going to increase the costs of doing the research and development. And hence, we're not going to be able to gain the savings that we would gain through biosimilar usage. And the savings are extremely important. Remember, we have new therapies, cell and gene therapies, rare disease drugs, autoimmune disorder, newer therapies in Alzheimer's that are coming out, and we need to be able to pay for them. So biosimilar usage is extremely important, and extrapolation allows it to be done in a cost-effective manner from a research and development standpoint, hence keeping the prices down when they are introduced into the marketplace.
Look, this sounds like a terrific idea. And it also sounds like there's a lot more to it than just a doctor saying, I think I'll prescribe this biosimilar.
Absolutely. So, Connor, here's a scenario you might be familiar with. You know how if you go to your pharmacy, often they give you the generic version of the medication instead of that brand name that your doctor originally prescribed?
Sure, of course. I think almost everyone has had that happen.
Well, people often wonder if that's also true for biosimilars. And guess what?
Oh God, don't tell me it's another big word.
Yep, there's a name for that too, interchangeability. This is super important to highlight because as someone taking a biosimilar, this might happen to you when you go to get or when you go to order your medication. And while this isn't happening yet for rheumatology patients, it could be in the near future. Here's Robert again.
Zoe, the designation of interchangeability is a regulatory designation by the FDA. It has nothing to do with the safety, efficacy, or purity of the biosimilar. If a biosimilar has an interchangeable designation, a pharmacist is then allowed to substitute an originator biologic with a biosimilar without having to get the permission of the healthcare professional who prescribed it. However, the lack of the designation of interchangeability does not prohibit the pharmacist from substituting. In that case, the pharmacist just has to get the approval of the healthcare professional who prescribed the originator biologic, and then they may substitute. In either case, it is the pharmacist's responsibility whether the biosimilar has an interchangeability designation or it does not to inform the patient that they are making the substitution.
So let's break this down with a real life example. And I'll use infliximab for the example since we were talking about it before with the naming.
Yeah, good idea. This is confusing enough already.
Okay, so here's my understanding. If I'm taking the biologic infliximab and it gets this interchangeable status, I may go to the pharmacy or infusion center and get a biosimilar instead, like infliximab-AXXQ, which is Avsola. But if it didn't have the interchangeable status, the pharmacy will have to ask my doctor before giving me the biosimilar in lieu of the biologic?
That's right. If given the interchangeable status, the pharmacist could substitute your biologic that was originally prescribed by your doctor with the biosimilar without first having to call your doctor for approval. It's kind of similar to that scenario with the generic medication that we mentioned before.
And are we seeing this happen?
Up until recently, no biosimilar in the US had the interchangeable designation. Part of the reason is that biosimilar manufacturers have to demonstrate that a patient could switch back and forth between the reference drug and the biosimilar at least 3 times, and this involves no differences in safety or effectiveness.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty high bar. So as of now, for most biosimilars, you still have to have a prescription specifically written for a biosimilar in order to get it?
That's right, except for 2. In July of 2021, the FDA did approve the first biosimilar, insulin glargine, as interchangeable.
That's used to treat certain types of diabetes, right? And that's the biosimilar of reference product Lantus?
It is. And just recently, the FDA granted interchangeable status for a Humira biosimilar called Siltezo. Now, this biosimilar won't be on the market until 2023. But once available, pharmacists will be able to substitute Cyltezo for the originator product without first consulting physicians. Next time on Breaking Down Biosimilars, we'll look at what types of patients a biosimilar could work for.
My experience learning about biosimilars was just like, this is a great option that I think will work for you from a medical professional that I really trusted, and learning that it was more of an issue in regards to what would be covered under my insurance and less of a concern in regards to how well it would help me.
We're going to hear how physicians talk to their patients about biosimilars and how patients decide to make the switch after having those important conversations.
We hope you learned something new about biosimilars and how they get approved in the US. We'd love to hear your feedback, so send your email to breakingdownbiosimilars@ghlf.org.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Down Biosimilars, a podcast that brings light to biosimilars and helps you better understand the role they play in your healthcare now and in the future. If you like this episode, give us a rating and write a review on Apple Podcasts and help more people like you find us. I'm Connor Mertens.
And I'm Zoe Rothblatt. See you next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.